Hello and happy Tuesday. I'm Carol Fleck, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled ADHD Then and Now, How Our Understanding Has Evolved. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Dave Anderson. Dr. Anderson is a clinical psychologist and the Vice President of School and Community Programs at the Child Mind Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to helping children and families struggling with mental health issues and learning disorders. Dr. Anderson was the Senior Director of the Child Mind Institute's ADHD and Behavior Disorder Center. He specializes in evaluating and treating children and adolescents with ADHD, anxiety, and mood disorders. In today's webinar, Dr. Anderson will talk about the storied past, present, and future of ADHD over the last 25 years. So much has changed since 1998, when the very first issue of Attitude was published. Back then, Bill Clinton was president, Adderall was only on the market for 2 years, and our mission then was as critical as it is now to be a voice for the ADHD community, to raise awareness around the serious issues and challenges of living with ADHD, and most importantly, to provide guidance from trusted experts to help individuals and families make informed decisions for the best possible outcomes. We'd like to begin today's webinar by asking this poll question to our live audience. What ADHD myth, believed by others or by you, has had the biggest impact on your life? Submit your comments in the text box under the video player. While you do that, I'll point out that live participants may submit questions anytime during the live event. To download the slides, click on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. If you're interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you'll receive about an hour after the live broadcast. A transcript of today's event will be made available in the coming week. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast number 447 to access the slides, the webinar replay, the Certificate of Attendance option, and the webinar transcript. And if you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up now for our latest spring issue. The ADHD Guide to Love, our cover story, offers expert relationship advice for couples dealing with emotional control, impulsivity, and other issues associated with ADHD. In this issue, you'll also learn why women and girls with ADHD are often misdiagnosed and a great consequence to their well-being. And our summer camp guide reveals the 6 questions you need to ask before registering your child and setting them up for success. Subscribe today to share Attitude Magazine with your family, a teacher, or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Brain Balance. Brain Balance is an integrative cognitive development program designed to help kids, teens, and adults with ADHD, learning differences, anxiety, and beyond improve focus, attention, and behavior. Brain Balance creates a customized plan based on your child's needs to support their social, emotional, and academic growth. An exploratory study with Harvard's McLean Hospital found the Brain Balance program to be as effective as low-dose stimulant medication in alleviating ADHD symptoms in children. Click the link on screen or visit brainbalance.com to learn about Brain Balance today. Attitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Dave Anderson. Thank you so much for joining us today and leading this discussion.
And thank you. Thank you to Attitude for having me. And I'm really excited to kind of engage in this discussion with you all because, This is a really interesting premise for a workshop, is to kind of reflect on Attitude's 25-year anniversary on how far the science, the treatment, and the understanding of ADHD has come over the last 25 years. So again, and I think Carol did a great job kind of reminding us that 25 years doesn't feel that long ago. Like, yes, it was pre-Y2K. Yes, Clinton was president, but it really isn't that much of a long time in terms of the arc of science or how much science can evolve, but there have been a lot of developments. So what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll be talking till about 1:40 Eastern time here, is about the history of the ADHD diagnosis, what we know of it as kind of a framing of the scientific arc, how our understanding of ADHD has evolved in 25 years. And it won't be an exhaustive summary of all the advances, but some of the major points in terms of what we know and what's emerged as lines of inquiry within the research. I think the most important thing, and this relates to my work and the fact that I spend a lot of my time with kids and teens with ADHD and thinking about kind of how we address these difficulties across development. It's the state of evidence-based ADHD treatment in 1998 and what we've learned over the past 25 years, where we are now. The last thing that I'll highlight is a couple slides on just the challenges that we experience in the field right now, the ongoing challenges really, and what challenges we're likely to face for the next 25 years, as well as the reasons why I'm hopeful for the future of science around ADHD and mental health in general. So, to kind of launch into this, first I'm going to talk about the history of the ADHD diagnosis. Now, there's a reason why I begin presentations with this slide. And the reason is to remind people that science is always in this kind of iterative state where it's getting better in terms of discovery, in terms of describing the phenomena that we are studying. But at the same time, we're never in the most perfect of all worlds. And to be sure, even though there have been myriad advances in ADHD over the last 25 years, this is not to say we're at the pinnacle right now, or that it will always be called ADHD or always be defined in this way. So it's important that we recognize kind of how far we've come, but also how far science still has to go. And in general, psychology is an incredibly young science. There is still a lot that we have to discover. But so if you look at the history of the ADHD diagnosis, and I've included a reference down here that's also in my reference slide at the end, that's looking at kind of the history of the diagnosis over time, it's often credited that there were physicians kind of describing the symptoms of ADHD behaviorally sometime around the end of the 18th century. And then that really most of the advances in understanding it as a diagnosis or utilizing that kind of medical model have come alongside advances in the 20th century and also the publications of the DSM by the American Psychiatric Association. But the reason why I show these names is to remind people that we're not that great in psychology at branding. We're not that great at naming. We've also had a lot of missteps and really terrible sins, at least over the course of psychiatry and psychology, in naming things and increasing stigma or naming things that weren't meant to be pathologized. So to think about kind of the history of ADHD, it's in the 1930s, people are noticing this condition is behaviorally sort of similar to those who've had brain injuries. And so at some level, we're thinking about this as, okay, maybe ADHD is representative of minimal brain damage. But then there's this thought that maybe that's stigmatizing, that it's damage. Instead, maybe it's some form of dysfunction. And so as we move into the 60s and early versions of the DSM, the description of these symptoms of ADHD is more kind of characterized as minimal brain dysfunction. Then as the DSM really starts hitting kind of its stride in the latter part of the 20th century and into the present day, we have hyperkinetic reaction of childhood, which is sort of addressing the understanding at that time of this as a likely childhood presenting set of symptoms and a kind of representing it as its most obvious set of symptoms, in the sense that the set of symptoms around hyperactivity and impulsivity are often the ones that can be most impairing, especially when they present in early childhood. So it's kind of capturing that like most visible level of the iceberg and the most visible kind of presentation zone. But again, that's still not capturing it. So as we move into 1980, we have the first appearance of the name attention deficit disorder. Now, ADD, begins around 1980. To this day, we still have people who call the disorder ADD, even though it hasn't been called that since 1987. And this is because, if that was the moment when you first learned about it, people tend to stick with the names where they first learned about something. So if you learned about it in the 80s, it might have been ADD. But in 1987, a new version of the DSM updated it to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Because the thinking was that as well, and this is one line of thinking around it, that the hyperactive impulsive symptoms were particularly stigmatized. So folks were, when diagnosing the disorder, oftentimes not assigning that set of symptoms unless they really, really met threshold, when in reality, even people diagnosed with the inattentive presentation or inattentive subtype often had some version of hyperactive impulsive symptoms. Or, as we've now learned over time, the subtypes or presentations are not as reliable as the diagnosis itself. So we don't want to kind of make it so that there's pressure to not diagnose part of this particular condition. Then in 1994, ADHD is designated with 3 subtypes: inattentive, hyperactive impulsive, and combined. But what research showed, and I'll get into this a little bit more in the understanding slides that I have coming up, what research showed is that the subtypes are not reliable over time. And this can decrease confidence in the diagnosis, in the sense that someone could be diagnosed with combined subtype as a child, but maybe in their adolescence or adulthood, it's more the inattentive symptoms that are prominent and impairing, and they no longer meet criteria for the combined subtype. And so in that sense, we don't want to decrease confidence in what is a reliable mental health diagnosis, ADHD, over the course of development by making people question whether or not their subtype is accurate. So that's where in 2013, it became 3 symptom presentations. So in that sense, you have ADHD, but at any point in your development, the symptoms might present differently. You might have inattentive presentation at one phase, maybe hyperactive impulsive presentation at another phase, or combined presentation, kind of evolving into another presentation itself. And there's definitely some thought about which sequence of presentations is more likely to happen over the course of development, combined into an sort of like lessening of hyperactive impulsive symptoms over time, so that many people might be diagnosed as inattentive as they get later on. But again, we want to increase folks' confidence related to the research on the reliability of the diagnosis, even if the ways that symptoms are presenting might be different. And the way that I often talk to students about this is that the symptoms of depression have hundreds of different combinations, and we still call it depression. It can look very different from person to person. We want to make room for that variability in ADHD and not have people question it based on a particular modifier when the diagnosis is still very relevant. So to start talking about how our understanding of ADHD has evolved, the first thing we do look at is the diagnosis. So over the last 25 years, the behavioral symptoms listed in the DSM-5 are still very similar to earlier versions of the DSM over the last couple decades in terms of these groupings of symptoms. So you can see on the left side of this slide, there's a grouping of symptoms for inattentive symptoms. There's a grouping of symptoms for hyperactive impulsive symptoms. And as many in the audience are aware, the way that you diagnose ADHD is you're looking for 6 out of 9 of the symptoms on either the inattentive or the hyperactive impulsive axis, or both. You can have 6 of 9 of each one. And that's dictating whether or not you get diagnosed with inattentive or hyperactive impulsive or combined presentation. At the same time, some of the qualifiers in the diagnosis are that we commonly think that symptoms should be present to some degree before age 12. It's something where these symptoms do tend to emerge during childhood. But even that qualifier is under research scrutiny in the sense that there is a line of research looking at whether or not there exists a late onset or adult onset form of ADHD. One thing that's very true in the sense that ADHD is thought of as being biologically or brain-based is that given that it's theorized to be biological or brain-based, it should be present across multiple settings. One of the ways we diagnose is that we're asking, is this present across home and school settings, or school and social settings, or social and home settings? We're looking for it to be present in at least 2 out of those 3, because the thought is that if it's only present in the home setting, or if it's only present in the school setting, there's a chance that the environment could be exacerbating either subclinical symptoms or causing certain behavioral symptoms that look like ADHD, but may not be the biological condition itself. So again, 6 out of 9 on either axis, symptoms present in multiple settings. And then, as I already described in the last slide, we've evolved into these sort of presentations of symptoms rather than these subtypes, knowing they may not be reliable across development. And then at the same time, we go back to this kind of acronym that, of course, has emerged in psychology over the course of the last few decades and with the DSM, that when we look at any diagnosis, we think of the acronym FIDI, which is frequency, intensity, duration, and impairment. When we as diagnosticians are asking people about their behavioral symptoms, the way that you discern whether or not someone's often continuously varying symptoms have reached the threshold where you might assign the diagnosis. Do they occur with such frequency, such intensity? Have they been occurring for a long enough duration and cause such impairment that it makes sense to assign this particular diagnosis? And if that's not true, then we think a little bit more about whether or not we're going to assign that diagnosis, or perhaps if the symptoms are better explained by another one, or if we plan to continue monitoring. So a few key concepts in our evolving understanding of ADHD. So as I've already kind of referenced, what we know from the last 25 years of research is that ADHD tends to be chronic. The majority of kids and teenagers diagnosed with ADHD still meet clinical criteria for the condition going on into adulthood. And at the same time, there's a lot of debate over whether or not there's a sort of lessening of certain symptoms that might cause the diagnosis to remit. In general, across the field, the thought is that ADHD is a condition to be chronically managed and one that does not just go away. There's some evidence that overdevelopment, hyperactive impulsive symptoms do remit or lessen to some degree, but at the same time, they may still be present at a higher level than they are in other adults, and they may still be impairing. Inattentive symptoms, to be sure, persist into adulthood and may continue to impair the person in relationships, in work settings, or in a variety of ways. As I've already discussed, there's the stability of diagnosis but not presentation across development. One of the things that's characterized the last 25 years of research is also a search for objective markers of ADHD symptoms. Can we find something that doesn't require a clinician like myself to be in the office asking questions about the FIDI related to symptoms, but can we actually find, for example, infrared markers of movement or particular performance on neuropsychological tasks that would allow us to index the risk for ADHD or combine them with a diagnostic interview in ways that would provide us more objective ways of diagnosing ADHD. And to be sure, while there's hope that at some point we might reach an additive model where we can give a certain number of tests or look at a certain number of core deficits that really tell us, with high confidence, even outside of the clinician's confidence in doing the diagnostic interview, yes, we think these symptoms are present, the science is still not at a place where there's necessarily a gold standard for how you combine those into a probabilistic model for diagnosis. There's just a lot of what might be called putative, objective markers of ADHD symptoms. But again, as I'm going to reference a little bit later on, large-scale, multi-site, open science data sharing brings us closer and closer to the idea that we might at some point discover either objective task-based markers or objective biological markers that would allow us to index risk for ADHD and better, make this not so much dependent on therapist subjectivity and the quality of a diagnostic interview. Another major concept in ADHD literature are mapping common comorbidities. So one of the things we know from a lot of the last couple decades of research is that ADHD rarely presents in isolation. And this is not only because we think there's a lot of genetic and brain-based systems that are common to both ADHD and other psychiatric disorders, meaning that if ADHD is present, there's likely a lot of vulnerability to certain other things. But there's also the environmental effects of ADHD that can cause certain comorbidities. So for example, we look at it as kids with ADHD are biologically already more predisposed to behavioral concerns in childhood and perhaps comorbid behavioral diagnoses, but also the environment facilitates that. ADHD symptoms can be viewed in a very stigmatized way, where adults' thoughts on those symptoms are that, the kid is just not trying hard enough, or they could focus if they tried, or they're just being really disruptive, or they mean to do this. And when we end up giving feedback to young children with ADHD that's negative day after day after day, oftentimes what ends up happening is you end up with a child who may have started off with merely a presentation of ADHD, but now is demonstrating, oppositional or defiant or kind of argumentative presentations to adults, partly because their belief is that adults really aren't on their side and are trying to kind of villainize even the greatest of effort they're trying to put into situations. Similarly, as we get later on in kind of the development of people or the developmental trajectory of people with ADHD, mood, anxiety, and substance use are also commonly comorbid. And again, this can be because of biological predisposition, or it can be because of the environment. ADHD is highly linked to peer rejection and academic failure and a host of other negative developmental outcomes that could make someone more prone to a depressive episode or more nervous about their kind of ability to perform in academic or social situations, or could lead them to just decide, you know what? I give up, and decide maybe they're going to try substances as a way of coping. Another thing that we're seeing in the evolving understanding over the last 25 years is an increasingly complex understanding of all the developmental factors involved, as well as the risks, environmental risks that can exacerbate ADHD symptoms, and the kind of developmental sequelae of ADHD, in the sense that with an early presentation of ADHD, we know that people with ADHD are more likely, for example, to be in traffic accidents, or to have perhaps tumultuous interpersonal relationships or peer difficulties, or more difficulty in long-term romantic relationships, or certain difficulties that will appear in long-term romantic relationships related to ADHD symptoms that show up in couples therapy, or, even most insidiously, we know that particularly in historically marginalized or disadvantaged communities, ADHD may not even be diagnosed. Kids may drop out of school or experience academic failure earlier, or they may be expelled from school earlier. And this can start a school to prison pipeline where many people might end up incarcerated before they even learn about ADHD as a diagnosis and realize that this was one of the things that perhaps caused academic difficulties early on. And, obviously at that point, we're at a situation we desperately want to prevent in terms of being able to change that person's life trajectory. The last thing, and Carol mentioned this related to the most recent issue of Attitude, is that we've learned a lot about sex differences in ADHD, and thinking about how ADHD might present differently or even in a mutually exclusive way in females, in the sense that, it's commonly thought even right now that females may be more likely to present with the inattentive cluster of symptoms and less likely to present with hyperactive impulsive symptoms. At the same time, because of stigma as well as thoughts related to gender role presentations, when females do present with ADHD symptoms, it can be thought that, in fact, it's more likely due to anxiety or depression, because those are things that are more common in terms of being a presentation that people are used to seeing in females early on. So people say, oh, well, she's distracted because she's anxious, or she's distracted because she's sad, not because she has ADHD. And that's something that we're actively trying to fight, even in clinician bias, in thinking if a female's presenting with these symptoms, we want to consider whether or not to include ADHD. There's also some research, again, on whether or not there might be a completely different presentation, at least in females, with a different time of onset and a different level of severity. And again, there's evolving research in that area. The last things that I'll highlight in evolving ADHD science is this. What's amazing about the kind of march of science over the last 25 years is that with new scientific discovery, some things are increased in their clarity. Some things become even more complex, and we realize we didn't understand them at all to begin with. And some things also come under scrutiny. And that's why I've grouped certain things on this slide, in the sense that one effort to kind of increase the clarity around ADHD diagnosis is with new kind of modifiers that may perhaps characterize certain presentations. So there are lines of research on how emotion regulation, relates to the original core ADHD symptoms that exist right now, and whether or not there might be reason to consider kids who have difficulty with emotional dysregulation as a different subtype of ADHD or a modifier in the diagnosis. And these are all things that look toward kind of future of the DSM. In addition, and I noticed that my slides have been modified by editors on the back end to spell out what SCT is. Sluggish cognitive tempo has been proposed as a potential modifier for the ADHD diagnosis or particular subtype. The reason why I often include it as an abbreviation, SCT, is because it's been considered particularly stigmatizing for children who are labeled as sluggish cognitive tempo, particularly the adjective sluggish. And so there's research, and I highlight this in the Sanuga-Bark reference down below, looking at whether or not it's better to relabel that particular modifier or subtype or presentation as kind of cognitive disengagement, which might be less stigmatizing and something that caregivers are less likely to say, wait a second, I don't want that applying to my kid. There's also a line of research on sleep difficulties as they relate to the core ADHD symptoms and as they represent perhaps a modifier or a subtype of the diagnosis. When I talk about increasing complexity, this relates to kind of the genetic, environmental, and epigenetic research in the sense that the last 25 years have shown huge advances in our understanding of gene influences on mental health disorders, the way that certain environmental factors might exert large effect sizes on the presentation of symptoms over time, and even in the term epigenetics, the way that the environment could actually change our gene expression over time, depending on what stressors we're facing or what protective factors we're facing. And what this means is that things we might earlier have thought of as perhaps more simple, like hoping to find a single cluster of genes that, determines ADHD. In fact, we find that there's not a single cluster of genes. There's in fact many, many genes that could play a role in defining risk for ADHD, and that those genes are also shared with many perhaps other mental health conditions. And what this also brings up for us is this kind of increasing complexity makes our head spin that says, well, maybe what we have behaviorally, as reliable as it is, and even as we don't want to abandon it, isn't necessarily cleaving mental health at the joints, that there might be reason to go back to all of our data and say, let's really approach this from square one in trying to define what kinds of genetic and environmental influences lead to different kinds of biological effects, understanding that ADHD may be a diagnostic term that either evolves over time or is better explained by multiple different subsets over time as we get more exact with our science. So again, that's what makes my head spin in the sense that our science evolves, but also suggests to us there may be a lot more complex answers where we're looking for simple ones, an objective marker of ADHD or a gene that defines it. And the last thing I'll highlight on that scale is the neuroscience research, which is that when you look over the last 25 years, we see the emergence of, fMRI research, for example, in ADHD, and early papers with perhaps small sample sizes in an fMRI scanner trying to outline particular brain areas or circuitry or kind of networks that might be implicated in ADHD. And to be sure, there are some core findings that have stood the test of time in the sense that we really do see in the neuroscience literature this implication that there are frontal structures in the brain that are under kind of utilized, activated, or networks that are underactive in terms of the presentation of ADHD individuals. And at the same time, there may be these networks that are sort of the default mode in the sense that they're the networks that are meant to be working when you're not task focused, but in fact are more activated in individuals with ADHD and likely interfering with the task focused networks that are meant to be focused on what you're trying to do. And in that sense, those core findings might hold up. But again, as science increases in complexity, what we're finding is that over the last 25 years, our science has become much more open. Institutions are sharing their data sets with other institutions so as to combine these into larger and larger data sets and test earlier findings for replication. At the same time, there's multiple large-scale multi-site studies that are national and global in looking at this data on ADHD or on brain science or on just general child development and a variety of mental health conditions that are causing certain conclusions from earlier on in the neuroscience research to be questioned, as they might not stand up to scrutiny with larger and larger sample sizes, and other findings to be considered even more solid because they are being supported by those large-scale multi-site studies. So again, really exciting stuff. Now to get to treatment. So here's what I want to focus in on first about treatment in 1998 and how it's evolved toward 2023. You're going to hear me use a term called evidence-based practice a lot in talking about psychosocial or pharmacological treatment for ADHD. One of the things that is difficult across the field is that there is a particular way that we as scientists think about how we develop an evidence-based practice. You begin with perhaps a clinician who utilizes an innovative approach with a certain number of, cases or a certain number of patients within their or their colleagues' practices. They begin to evolve this approach and they say, look, we think this is really helping, some of the kids who are diagnosed with this particular condition. Then you focus on defining those core components of that treatment. How can I define this so I can teach other people to do the same thing that I'm doing? So we know it's not just me. It's not just the clinician effect. It's the treatment itself that is causing that change. So how do I define that? How do I write it down? Like a lot of times people have negative associations with the word manualization. The reason why you write a manual is because you want to be able to train other people to do the same thing that you're doing and be able to do it reliably with the same effects. And that gets you to a point where the field can really progress. Because the reality is, you don't want your medical doctor doing something differently for a sinus infection than every other medical doctor in the field. You want every medical doctor in the field trained on a uniform approach that relieves your sinus infection. It is the same thing with a mental health condition. You want to be able to develop a standardized uniform approach that every clinician can use to great effect and to reduce suffering and provide kind of transformative changes in a person's life that increase kind of their abilities to live in a way that is enjoyable or is full of fulfilling relationships or allows them to pursue whatever goals they might have. So we define these core components of treatment. We define the outcomes, how we know the treatment is working. And then we begin trials with larger and larger scale populations. So what you're trying to do is randomize people into different conditions where at first, maybe you have a control group where people are getting really no intervention, and you're seeing just, does the intervention that I have created outperform people who are getting no intervention? Or people are getting a placebo who believe they're getting intervention, which what we know of humans is that when you believe you're getting treatment, odds are you will get to some degree better and you will report that you are getting better. And so we need to make sure that our new treatment outperforms placebo or people's belief that they are just getting better. And then finally, can you compare your treatment to well-established treatments that work and show that sort of equivalence? And then lastly, once you've shown that you can randomize people to different treatments, that you can show that your treatment performs well against a control group or against placebo, and that your treatment performs well against comparison treatments, can you get people other than you to replicate it? Because what's very common when you're proselytizing about an intervention is that the people who've created that intervention have the most passionate disciples who also then believe that that intervention is working. And there is a lot that comes from a clinician's confidence that what they're doing works. And so you want to also show that you can train other people who may not be as fervently followers of that intervention to replicate your results. Now, here's the issue. We talk about 25 years. 25 years is a long time, but at the same time, it's a very short time for developing evidence-based practices. It takes a long time to go from start to finish in really showing that someone has an evidence base. And there's a reason for this. It's that our objective is that people who are suffering get standardized treatment that is most likely to help. And at the same time, because treatment often takes a lot of a patient's time and money, we want to make sure that people aren't swindled, that people are not given false hope, that people are not given placebos that may, wear off in their effect immediately once people, and I should say that's two different things right there. We want to make sure that treatment's effects are long-term. We want to make sure that it's not just a placebo. And really, this is all about making sure that people get the best support possible. At the same time, it can be really difficult when the effective treatments are still so time and cost intensive. And that's what you're going to see even as we talk about the state of treatment now. So in 1998, and I'm highlighting, kind of a summary and an overall analysis that Pelham and colleagues did in 1998. But this is where the science stood. What we knew, and sorry, it looks like I made a little typo where I said the evidence base, but it's really the evidence base, not evidence-based treatments. Either way, I'm going to delete a word there. But the evidence base at that time was for medication being effective in terms of, you start a child on stimulant medication and can see that it can address their ADHD symptoms, particularly during school hours, while they're in school, perhaps help them to increase their focus and their ability to complete academic tasks. The evidence base is around behavioral, parent, and school interventions. So in that sense, we knew even in 1998, there are certain models of treatment we can work with parents and coach any caregiver on certain behavioral skills, particularly with children under the teenage years, that can get parents to a point where they can manage, say ADHD symptoms as they present in the hot zones, in the morning, in the afternoon, during homework, during, family meals, and right before bedtime. And at the same time, what we knew even at that time was that multimodal treatment, in other words, doing behavioral treatment where you coach parents and you go into schools and coach and consult with teachers and provide a child medication, may be more effective than either one alone. And at the same time, in 1998, what we knew at that time was that even though both medication and behavioral parent and school interventions were effective, medication had some evidence that it was more effective to some degree if you were going to choose one. Now, the identified challenges and gaps at that time were that there was a large prevalence still of non-evidence-based treatment for ADHD. Across the field. And this applied both to evidence-based treatments being misapplied to ADHD and non-evidence-based treatments being applied. So in that sense, what's being scoped is that play therapy, is not effective for ADHD. This is not saying that therapists doing play-based interventions can't be extremely supportive or can't really help their patients or help with emotion regulation or help in terms of treatment with play-based interventions for certain other things. It's just that for ADHD, there's no evidence that it generalizes. There's no evidence that those skills generalize outside the therapist's office. And that is still true. It was true in 1998. It's still true in 2023. The other issue as well is that there wasn't necessarily an evidence base for applying standard individual cognitive behavioral interventions in the room. So a lot of the thought was, okay, as teenagers get a little bit older, we need to make sure that we know that cognitive behavioral interventions, might work for teenagers as they apply them to ADHD symptoms and as they take more responsibility for their symptoms as they get older. And there really wasn't too much evidence in support of that either in 1998. At the same time, other major gaps that were kind of identified is that with many of the treatments available, whether it's medication or behavioral interventions, there's concern about short-term effects in the sense that you do the intervention, but then when you take away the intervention, whether it's the medication or the therapist's presence in coaching and, overseeing the behavioral intervention, the effects can go away and not be sustained. A symptom improvement ceiling. So Pelham in this article did a good job, Pelham and colleagues, in highlighting the fact that a lot of these interventions were only bringing kids to about a standard deviation, which is a statistical term, but kind of in the range of what would be considered the typical range for children their age in terms of behavior, but not necessarily fully getting into that typical range. And then at the same time, there were gaps in the treatment for teenagers and for helping with peer relationships. And that's been some of the focus over the last 25 years. So to flash forward to 2023, there have been a lot of advances. So first, let's start with the bad news. Even in the last 25 years, there is weak evidence that certain things which have gotten a lot of smoke, but have not really caught fire. And I mean that as kind of a metaphor in the sense that these things have been really touted in media as potential kind of transformative or game-changing treatments. But at this stage, and again, going back to my slide on how long it takes to get to a point of evidence-based practice, these things still have very weak evidence that they're effective or even close to as effective as established evidence-based practices for ADHD. So cognitive training is one thing. So in that sense, computer-based programs that are self-guided where a child practices certain skills, and then we hope that that will map on to their focus or executive functioning in real life. There is not evidence that that happens. At the same time, there's at least some encouraging findings that when you have an adult mediating the transfer of those skills to real life, there may be a chance that some of those skills can transfer. But again, it's kind of this question of like, well, should we just have the adult teach the skills and transfer them anyway? Is it that we can make it more cost effective by having there be an online training program? But again, can we get the same effects if there's an adult mediating the transfer of skills from the online program? Because again, the hope there is that you get a more cost-effective thing. The kid can be on a screen, which kids with ADHD might be more likely to actually invest in. And then you might just need an adult to foster the generalization. But again, that evidence is very weak. It's just kind of a hope. Neurofeedback is also, at this point, a very weak strength of evidence in terms of its evidence-based use. Now, I'm not saying that, I don't hope that at the Child Mind Institute at some point we have a row of neurofeedback computers where I ask every kid with ADHD to do 30 minutes of neurofeedback when they walk in the door 10 years from now. There's hope that that might be where it is, but we've not cracked this yet. And there's not evidence that would make it so that I would set that up in the lobby. And oftentimes when people do tout the effects of neurofeedback, what we're seeing is that kids might get other evidence-based interventions. And then what people really like to do is assign the effect to neurofeedback or to the computer program when in reality was coming from the legwork that was being done by the people surrounding that child in their social network. Again, another piece around, last 25 years is that physical activity, there have been studies of physical activity as intervention. It's a weak strength of evidence. And at the same time, omega-3s, which are thought of as kind of a supplement that kids might be able to take, or fish oil. There's still weak evidence that those necessarily help with ADHD symptoms, even though fish oil might be healthy for the general population in general, or omega-3s might be. In terms of the advances in ADHD treatment over the course of the last 25 years, there's been a lot of examinations of factors that might affect success in existing evidence-based practices. So to that end, one of the major areas of research has been, for example, parental mental health concerns. So if we address a caregiver's mental health concerns, does that help increase the chance that the treatment for their child for ADHD might be more successful? And that can range from a caregiver's own ADHD symptoms, which was a previous presentation that I did for Attitude a couple of years back, or it might be, for example, caregiver depression. So there's a good line of research there about those factors that might affect success. At the same time, highlighting what Pelham and colleagues showed in 1998, there's been great research over the last 25 years on behavioral peer interventions and skills coaching around social skills, particularly for kids with ADHD or kids who are on the spectrum or kids who are experiencing that comorbidly. And there's now very strong evidence base that we can actually see growth in social skills and address what is a common area of impairment for kids with ADHD. At the same time, there's been great advances in organizational skills trainings across a wide range of models. I include actually in my resources slide at the end here a book by Gallagher and Abacoff and I believe Spira, which is kind of an organizational skills training model developed at NYU for kids in elementary school and early middle school grades. But there's been a lot of advances over the last couple decades in organizational skills trainings and addressing, again, executive functioning deficits that are really common with ADHD symptoms. There's also been research on the sequencing of psychosocial and psychiatric intervention. So understanding that, the success of intervention, if you're going to say go with medication and behavioral intervention at the same time, that can be the most superior form of treatment in terms of outcomes. But if you choose to sequence, there's evidence showing that going with a psychosocial treatment first, say behavioral, parent, and coaching and school consultation, might be better in terms of outcomes than starting with medication. And, one thought on that is that if you start with medication and medication isn't working, parents are often even more discouraged about whether or not psychosocial treatment will work because it's more effort, and the thing that was less effort already hasn't shown as much of an effect. Another thing that's been an area of advance over the last 25 years is incorporation of adolescent-specific techniques. So looking at that kind of zone that Pelham and colleagues identified and saying, look, we don't necessarily have great ways of engaging adolescents. And while a lot of people are willing to utilize cognitive behavioral techniques in trying to kind of help adolescents to address their ADHD symptoms, maybe there are other strategies here like motivational interviewing and collaborative problem-solving methods that can help to build kind of family alliances and can also help to build teen investment in addressing their ADHD symptoms. And then the last thing, which I think was really well highlighted by Evans and colleagues in this 2017 summary, is that we've really looked over the last 25 years at ensuring that the research done on ADHD treatment includes representation from diverse populations. And that's a major area of work across the entire field. So to begin wrapping up to get to our Q&A portion here, I'll just talk about my brief slide on challenges and hopes. So the challenges that we still have in the field of ADHD are as follows. Effective psychosocial treatment, whether it's behavioral parent training, school consultation, behavioral peer interventions, organizational skills training, is still high effort. It requires the adults and the social support surrounding a kid or teen with ADHD to really invest in those interventions. Now, granted, it can be for a short time with great longitudinal results. It might be for a period of only 3 to 5 months. But it's still high effort, and there's usually need for ongoing maintenance at developmental transitions to think about new presentations of ADHD symptoms. That can be tough for people, especially people who are suffering, and especially people who are already, in a high-stress place when they begin to present for treatment. Psychiatric intervention is still heavily scrutinized and stigmatized. I know that's unlikely to be surprising to many of you listening, but the reality is we have an incredible shortage of child and adolescent psychiatrists in this country and an incredible wealth of media narratives about the evils of psychiatry. And so what that means is that even where there are effective treatments studied for decades, and ADHD medication are some of the most well-studied of any psychiatric medication class, there is still a lot of stigma associated with it, a lot of trepidation amongst caregiver populations about when and how how early one might be willing to use medication, and that sets us back. There's an ineffectiveness of unproven treatments that can then decrease investment in mental health care. So there's a lot, as I was even highlighting on the kind of state of things in 2023. If a parent invests in a cognitive training program or giving their child fish oil or a neurofeedback program and it doesn't work, or even things that there might be some research on, I will say that those things have some research and may in the future be effective interventions. There are a lot of other things out there that have no research associated with them. And when parents are told this could be effective for your kid and do not see it as effective, it increases mental health stigma, it decreases help seeking, it decreases a kid or a teen's sense that they can be helped and may also lead them to develop even more comorbid mental health concerns. So again, we don't want people to have to invest in unproven treatments. We want them to get high quality evidence-based practice. ADHD diagnosis is still highly stigmatized. People still debate whether or not it exists, whether it's a problem of effort, especially as we have generational debates in the media now about, different generations' level of investment and work ethic and things like that. ADHD can get lumped into those things as a cop-out or something where people think if they just tried, it would be, much easier for them, when in reality, this is real, it is biologically based, and it is something that is it is difficult to manage and needs to be something that we think about, in terms of how we adapt to support people who are experiencing these symptoms. Again, I've already referenced this in the presentation. Those diagnosed with ADHD are incredibly vulnerable to a wide range of negative life experiences. And this also decreases perhaps their ability or willingness to seek help because, again, as I discussed earlier, if you end up in the school to prison pipeline as a result of undiagnosed ADHD, that can decrease your ability to even get help. And meanwhile, if you're rejected by peers or if you experience academic failure, that can also decrease your belief that people are there to help. And finally, mental health parity and access to care remain grave concerns. And that access to care is even more pronounced for those who are of low socioeconomic status or historically marginalized or underserved. So where is the hope? The hope is that our science continues advancing. We have even more evolving tools to understand the brain and mental health beyond just those behavioral symptoms, that even as I described, the new complexity and scrutiny that comes along with the advance of genetics and neuroscience, there is reason to believe that the future holds precision medicine, the ability to better kind of delineate the developmental risk factors or genetic risk factors a person might have and be able to precisely recommend a course of treatment that's particularly, tailored to that level of factors and kind of someone's landscape of what makes them not only risk but also protective factors. There's also advances in treatment. So we have a huge focus across the field right now on expanding the mental health workforce, on ensuring that we recruit diverse and representative clinician populations to meet the mental health needs in this country and across the world. The pandemic has pushed us to capitalize on the potential of telehealth as a way of perhaps extending our reach in the mental health field, and to be sure has nudged us to do so in a myriad of ways. And at the same time, we see that there are more intensive intervention approaches being developed in the literature that suggest that maybe there could be a shorter term of intervention that's more high intensity, but that returns people to their kind of typical rhythm of life, but without having to go through treatment for even a period of a few months, and with the same kind of effects. And then lastly, there's societal advances. We continue to fight mental health stigma on a variety of levels. We continue to build equity in mental health. There are movements, and I cite Sanuka Bark's summary of this in a paper on my references. There are movements toward relabeling kind of these categories as neurodivergence or other less stigmatized terms, and thinking about how we adapt the world to think about how there are a variety of ways that we are all neurodivergent and neuroconvergent, and to make space for that instead of thinking of it as a kind of like, dichotomous disorder and non-disorder conceptualization, but that we all kind of vary along certain characteristics and are, neuroconvergent and divergent in certain ways. And then lastly, the thing that gives me the greatest hope is anytime anyone talks about mental health care as a fundamental human right. It is something where I want everyone to have a therapist or access to a therapist, not just because it increases the validity of my profession, but at the same time because I just think it helps humanity. So I will leave it at that with a slide on selected resources and move to the Q&A portion of the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for that great information. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to thank Brain Balance once more for sponsoring this webinar. Now to our many questions. How can we dismantle the old stereotypes that claim ADHD doesn't exist or that it's a hyperactive boy thing?
I mean, it's a good question. In general, the difficulty with those stereotypes is I find that if someone is really, really devoted to the idea that something doesn't exist, it's very hard to prove its existence, even when the evidence might be staring folks in the face. So, you know, in this sense, I just go back to three words: real, common, and treatable. Mental health and learning disorders are real, common, and treatable. And the more people we can get who agree with that particular statement, the better we're breaking down stigma. And if folks don't necessarily want to be convinced, you know, I look at that as a difficulty we have with empathy, a difficulty we have in putting ourselves in other people's shoes and in perspective taking, and a difficulty we have with wanting science to be perfect. Because the reality is, as I've highlighted in this presentation, ADHD still isn't perfect. The diagnosis isn't perfect. It is still based on behavioral symptoms and, to some degree, subjective clinical impressions and the idea that a clinician is well trained enough to diagnose it reliably. But at the same time, the suffering is real and the need for support is real. And the quicker that we realize that mental health and learning disorders are real, the more quickly we also acknowledge they're common, in the sense that 1 in 5 people have a diagnosable mental health learning disorder. And the more quickly we get to the final adjective in there, which is that they are treatable. And we all start talking about how we can get more access to that.
Okay. I have a few questions around education.
Sure.
Many teachers say they haven't received adequate training to effectively handle the classroom behaviors associated with ADHD. Why do you think this hasn't changed over the years all that much? And what can we do to help teachers better understand and deal with these challenges from students?
I mean, I think part of the difficulty is that we, as I think any educator will tell you, we continue to ask more and more and more of educators. It isn't just support for ADHD in the classroom, it's support for a wide variety of mental health skills and mental health supports in the classroom, in addition to the evolution of certain curricula, in addition to all kinds of different things that are well documented as trends within educational settings. So teachers have so many demands placed upon them. And even though I think, you know, and this is relating to my work as the head of school and community programs at the Child Mind Institute, I've never met a teacher who wasn't, I should phrase that, not a double negative. Every teacher I meet is devoted to the mental health of their students. At the same time, it's a question of how we solve for X. It's, you're going to have, for example, if you've got a classroom of 20 students, you're going to have 4 students who have a diagnosable mental health and learning disorder. And odds are one of those is a kid with ADHD. And it's kind of, how do we think about not necessarily making it so that educators are, you know, thinking of interventions just for that kid with ADHD, but about creating a classroom that from the get-go is supportive for all the students in it. So again, this relates back to kind of the point I was making about a movement toward neurodivergence, where the training that I would hope would be more integrated for educators going into the future is this kind of question of like, how can we make sure there's a basic, like, you know, level of training for all educators on how to create a space in a classroom that is supportive of social emotional development and particular, you know, mental health supports across all diagnostic levels. And then to that point, how we can get a movement going in every single district across the country to give teachers, you know, clinically proven support within a classroom that doesn't increase the burden, but helps them to think, how can I make it so that my interaction with that one particular or 3 particular students in my class are changed slightly in terms of strategies so that it could be more successful in the way that I provide support.
On the flip side of that, someone writes, how might education evolve to capture and ignite these wonderful neurodiverse brains?
Yeah. So I think that relates to some of these these sort of philosophical conversations, in the sense that, you know, you can approach this one of 2 ways. There's short-term solution and long-term solution. Short-term solution is what a lot of educators and districts and schools do, which is bring in mental health professionals who hopefully have experience across educational settings as well, to speak to teachers about what ADHD looks like in the classroom setting and how they can provide support in an appropriate way within the setting, while also thinking about when they might need outside help and how to find it. That's kind of short term. And then the long term is thinking, well, how can we really take this from a sort of design perspective and say, how do we design classrooms to be supportive of a wide variety of neurodivergent, sort of presentations, and not just think of it as, okay, there's going to be this many students that the classroom is good for in this way, and then this many students for which we need to adapt it. That might be a conceptualization that hopefully evolves over time.
How can we address clinician bias? We know it exists. We know it because girls and women aren't diagnosed as they should be, or they're misdiagnosed. Older adults either aren't diagnosed or are getting diagnosed in their 50s and 60s and beyond. How can we address this to better inform clinicians?
I mean, it relates to about the same kind of mechanisms that we're talking about for educators. But one of the things that's true also of clinicians across this country is that, we often talk about how if you go to medical school anywhere in the country, you're often taught the same approach to treating particular diagnoses. So if the patient in front of you has pneumonia, there are certain very tried and true ways that you will treat that thing that have, incredible scientific basis. Whereas depending on where you go to graduate school across this country, you can be trained in a wide variety of both evidence-based and non-evidence-based ways to approach ADHD symptoms. And that really hurts us as a field. So there's one thing that I think is kind of a movement to better standardized training, where we're not necessarily saying that perhaps approaches that haven't been studied as much or don't lend themselves to evidence-based as much are to be thrown out, but that if you see a patient with a certain presentation in front of you, the evidence-based approach needs to be, your first attempt, to make sure also that clinicians are trained to treat the very things that present in front of them. So if a clinician is seeing a patient and they're not experienced at treating ADHD, or they don't have experience, with that particular diagnosis, they perhaps have a referral network where they don't feel like they are abandoning the patient by not treating, because that happens for a lot of clinicians. And it's also fighting messaging around clinicians not wanting to stigmatize their patient. There are a lot of clinicians who know that it's easier to tell a parent oftentimes your child's nervous than it is to tell a parent your child has ADHD, because ADHD is seen as chronic and ADHD is seen as more difficult to manage, and ADHD does have more stigma. And so we want to make sure that clinicians are being given kind of training on having that kind of courage to say, look, I got to do a really detailed diagnostic evaluation, and I also have to trust the impressions I'm getting here that tell me that your child may have a diagnosis that is much harder to give, but at the same time will benefit the child in the long run to have their diagnosis correctly labeled.
What do we know now about ADHD across the lifespan that we didn't know before?
So I won't say that the ADHD across the lifespan has progressed as much as some of the other lines of thought that I've talked about here, in the sense that there has been some, I think, great research in understanding the presentation of adult ADHD and how that might impair, relationships and job functioning. That's definitely something that's there. But one of the areas of research that's often identified that really isn't well understood is even ADHD in older adults, and understanding how that affects kind of things that happen in the latter decades of life. So I think there's still a lot, because so much of the research is focused on, ADHD in childhood and adolescence because of the concern about how it interacts with school. Whereas in later life, there's, I think, less of an impetus to kind of study ADHD in adulthood, partly because of that lack of kind of parental stress at what's going on for their child. At the same time, with adulthood, there's positive lines of research, in the sense that there is, emerging lines of research trying to look at, like, okay, not so much a disorder-focused view of ADHD, but a strengths-based view of ADHD, and trying to think about what might happen after you emerge from those school years, where perhaps ADHD could lend itself to perhaps increased creativity, or the hyperfocus that might be common for certain people with ADHD could lend to, investment in a particular career path. So again, there's a lot to be done in thinking about ADHD in the adult years.
We had quite a few questions around anxiety and ADHD, and one question was, how does a clinician distinguish between anxiety rooted in trauma versus anxiety associated with ADHD? And I'll add, does it even matter in terms of treatment?
I mean, it does. So anxiety. So a couple things. First, what the research shows is that kids who present with comorbid anxiety and ADHD may actually have better outcomes than kids who present with ADHD alone. And there's a host of hypotheses around that, but it's a really interesting point. The other thing related to that particular question is that when we do a diagnostic interview for a kid, it is very important for us to understand whether or not a kid might be experiencing post-traumatic stress, or might be experiencing social anxiety, or it might be presenting as generalized anxiety or OCD, because those all have different treatment approaches, especially as they relate to the ADHD diagnosis. So in that sense, when we talk about trauma, for example, the most evidence-based approach to treating trauma is that you teach a kid certain coping skills up front, and then you move through a trauma narrative, thinking, working with that child on exposing themselves to aspects of the trauma they've experienced. And then as you move through that trauma narrative and you see their post-traumatic symptoms perhaps decreasing, you can kind of close the intervention and help the child to, set up a social network that can be a source of ongoing support, whether it's caregivers or teachers or others. Whereas, it might be very different sort of exposures for a kid with social anxiety or a kid with a specific phobia, say, of crowds or of dogs. So again, it's really important to get the right anxiety diagnosis. And then it's really important to think about how those things correlate with ADHD. So for example, kids with social anxiety and ADHD, where we already know that ADHD can lead to difficulties with social skills, kids can then be even more likely to avoid social situations because of their anxiety, and then even more impaired on the level of social skills. So again, we really want to understand deeply where the sources of a diagnosis are coming from so that we can target intervention effectively.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. That has to be our last question, but we thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with our ADHD community. Next week, our free webinar is titled The Nurtured Heart Approach: Positive Parenting and Teacher Strategies to Transform Problem Behaviors with Dr. Howard Glasser. We hope you can join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.